think I'm going to take the liberty of getting us going then. It's a couple minutes after 2. So again, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Kim. I'm the Executive Director of Education Law Center. Just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. This session is being recorded. So wanted to let everyone know that. And also, we will be hearing from our distinguished panelists throughout this session. And if you would like to ask a question and direct it to one or all of our panelists, you can type that in the Q&A function of Zoom. Do not type it into the chat, but instead use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions. So without further ado, I just wanted to get us going here. I'm tremendously excited to be hosting our annual Making the Grade webinar. As you all know, Making the Grade is our national school funding report, and it's a really important part of our work here at Education Law Center to focus on school funding issues and research and data, alongside other activities of ours, such as our legal activities in the states. We host an annual litigators workshop in which we bring lawyers together to focus on school funding, law, and advocacy. We engage in other types of research around school funding and policy, and also provide technical assistance to many partners, including many of you, I hope, around the country around school funding matters. So with that, I am very pleased to get us going here. I'm going to introduce our panelists and we'll get right to it. First, I would like to introduce our guest panelist, DeAndrea Byrd, who is joining us from Georgia, where she's an Education Policy Fellow at IDRA and an active member of the National Parent Union. Her bio and everyone's bio should be in the chat. We'll also be joined by Kris Nordstrom, who from North Carolina. Kris is a senior policy analyst with the Education and Law Project at North Carolina Justice Center. So welcome, Kris, as well. And then finally, last but certainly not least, I want to introduce my colleague, ELC Research Director Danielle Farrie, who is our lead author of our Making the Grade report and a real expert on school funding issues, both in our home state of New Jersey, but also on matters around the country as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you, Bob. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or morning if it happens to be. So I'm going to, go through a presentation of the results of the most recent Making the Grade report, and then we're going to turn it over to a conversation with our panelists about sort of more state-focused advocacy efforts. So when Making the Grade was published late last year, we were in the midst of basically unprecedented uncertainty in school funding. The threats of massive education cuts in the FY26 federal budget were still looming. Grants for public schools were getting canceled left and right because they didn't align with the administration's policies. And DOGE had taken the hammer to many critical offices within the education department, including the Institute for Education Sciences, the Office of English Language Acquisition, the Office of Special Education Programs, and the Office of Civil Rights. Plenty of court cases had been filed, some of which resulted in some of those workers returning to work, though Linda McMahon has continued on her mission to dismantle her own department through interagency agreements that transfer the work of the education department to other agencies. This upheaval made us take a step back, realize that we can no longer take some things for granted. Making the Grade has always focused on state policy as the main driver of school funding fairness, and we still believe that to be true. But when federal revenue that disproportionately is targeted towards the country's low-income schools is threatened, we need to have a clear conversation about what that would mean for the nation's students. So this edition of Making the Grade does continue to predominantly focus on state policy and state and local revenue, but because we do think that fair school funding systems are more important than ever, but we've added a discussion of the impact on federal revenue to try and highlight how federal investments do improve equity-focused educational opportunities for students. Of course, that doesn't let states off the hook as they create the foundation and distribute the lion's share of revenue. Okay, so now that we sort of set that context of what we're going to cover today, let's take a little step back and define some of the concepts. The report is built on the principle that in order to be fair, school funding must be both adequate and equitable. So this means that states provide an overall level of funding that's sufficient to provide all students with the resources that they need to meet state standards, and that the funding should be distributed so that students in poverty receive more, and also that the state is making a reasonable effort to raise the revenue that's required to meet conditions 1 and 2. In order to evaluate states' fairness, we construct 3 measures of funding fairness: level, distribution, and effort. Before I get into each measure, I want to emphasize that these measures are comparative in nature. We're ranking states and grading them on a normal curve. So there are no benchmarks for the right funding level or the right distribution, but we are simply providing relative rankings of how states compare to each other. So that means that even states that get an A and or a B may still have room for improvement. I think it's more important than ever to draw attention to where we get our data from. We could not do this analysis without federal data collections from Census, the National Center for Education Statistics, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. In fact, one of the measures that we used to adjust revenue for regional differences when it was not updated this year, so we did have to rely on a year-old adjustment. And the complicated revenue collections that rely on districts to complete surveys are then reviewed and cleaned by federal workers and if their capacity to do that is either eliminated or reduced, the validity of these reports is going to be questionable. So even in typical times, the data take a long time to go through the collection and review process. The finance data that was released by Census last summer, which is the data that we use in this report, are from the 2022-23 school year. So delays in that process are going to put us even further behind. Okay, so as we go through the findings, I'm going to keep the definitions of our indicators brief, but if you want more information, we do have a technical appendix that defines them in more detail. So our first measure is funding level. So we look at state and local revenue only, but do adjust for regional differences in costs. And we compare average per pupil revenue across the states. We find there are significant disparities in per pupil funding, with many states spending thousands of dollars per pupil more than the national average, and other states spending thousands of dollars per pupil less. The highest funded state, New York, spends about 2.5 times as much as the lowest funded state, which is Idaho. And even after adjusting for regional cost differences, the highest funded states are largely in the Northeast, while the lowest funded states mostly span the South and the Southwest. We also find that most states maintained or at least slightly increased their per pupil funding levels from 2022, even after adjusting for inflation. So this is a dramatic departure from the previous year when high inflation rates basically wiped out most of the nominal per pupil funding increases in most states. Our second measure is funding distribution, which compares the average funding levels between the highest and lowest poverty districts within a state, while controlling for some other factors. And states are then categorized as either progressive, regressive, or flat, where progressive states allocate more funding to high poverty districts and regressive states allocate less. In 2023, 17 states met our definition of progressive. 19 had a flat distribution and 12 states were regressive. States had a wide range, with the most progressive state, which was Utah, providing about 60% more funding to high poverty districts, and the most regressive state, which is Connecticut, providing on average about 20% less to high poverty districts. One of the more troubling findings from this year's report is that a decade-long trend of increasing progressivity among states was reversed. the number of progressive states dropped from 28 to 17 in just 1 year, with most of those formerly progressive states slipping towards a flat distribution. So our third measure is effort, which is measured as state and local education revenue as a percentage of each state's fiscal capacity. So we measure that as the state's GDP. The state's effort, along with its fiscal capacity in terms of per pupil GDP, per capita GDP, determine how much funding schools have. So again, while there's no right level of effort for every state, these rankings can give some indication of places that may be able to improve conditions simply by raising their effort, either to be more in line with the national average or increasingly even up to its own prior levels of effort. A state's effort must be evaluated in relation to its economic wealth. So a high wealth state and a low wealth state can make equal effort, but the wealthy state is going to generate a lot more funding from that effort than the low wealth state. In 2023, state effort ranged from a high of 5.4% in Vermont to a low of 2% in North Carolina. Most high effort states were able to generate above average funding levels, even when they had below average fiscal capacity. For example, Vermont and Michigan and Maine. There are other low effort states like Delaware and North Dakota that are able to generate above average funding levels because of their high fiscal capacity, even with low effort. But too often, states with low fiscal capacity like Florida and Arizona are at a double disadvantage because they're also making a below average effort to fund their schools, leading to low funding levels. Nationally, we have seen the effort index decline over time as state and local revenue for education has not kept pace with broader economic growth. But there are some notable exceptions. California and Hawaii both dramatically improved their position on the effort index ranking due to substantial investments in public school funding. So as I said earlier, we wanted to call attention to the role that federal revenue plays in school funding fairness, even while we acknowledge that the biggest lever for school funding reform comes at the state level. The initial push to dramatically reduce funding for K-12 programs did not come to fruition this year, but the threats still remain. To try and quantify this, we ran our funding level and funding distribution measures with federal revenue. But because of the one-time influx in federal COVID funds, we actually had to go back to the 2019 data to make sure that we were showing patterns that were more typical. So the data on individual federal programs in the finance data is a little bit limited, but this chart shows that the biggest federal categories of funding, with about 75% of the federal funding, come from school meal funding, Title I, and then IDEA. And then the remaining 25% comes from other smaller discretionary and non-discretionary funding streams. So the three big buckets are all distributed with household income playing at least some role in how much funding school districts get. So our two big takeaways from this are that while federal funding does not actually do that much to improve within state equity, it does in fact contribute to greater between state equity. It doesn't do much to improve between state equity, but it does contribute to greater within state equity in nearly every state. It's not a magic bullet, but it does contribute to funding fairness. So on between state equity. So the average amount of federal revenue that states receive from per pupil funding varies significantly, from a low of $754 per pupil in Utah to a high of over $1,700 in West Virginia. And while this funding is no doubt important, it does not, again, do much to change the between state disparities in funding. In other words, when we add federal funding, the rankings on our funding level measure don't dramatically change, and there are still wide disparities between the highest and lowest spending states. But for within state equity, because most federal funding is allocated relative to student poverty or some other measure that's often correlated with student poverty, for example, English learner status, migrant status, or rural location, the allocation of federal funds leads to a more progressive within state distribution of revenue. In fact, this is true in nearly every state, regardless of the underlying state and local distribution. So that means that some regressive states became less regressive when we add federal funding in, while others improved to a flat distribution. Some flat states became progressive, and other progressive states became even more progressive. So while we usually are talking about ways to advocate for fair school funding at the state and local level, it's really important now to talk about the significant role that federal revenue plays in improving school funding conditions, even if the impact of that federal funding is smaller than state policy. So proposals to significantly reduce federal funding or to give states more flexibility in how federal funds are distributed to districts and schools could have a significant negative impact on school funding fairness. Higher poverty districts, which disproportionately rely on federal funding programs, are most likely to be severely affected by federal funding losses or reallocations. Instead of reducing federal investments or loosening federal oversight, Congress must act to strengthen federal programs and to further reduce inequities in education by incentivizing states to improve their school funding formulas. So I want to close out my presentation by sharing some of the tools that we have created that hopefully make it a little bit easier for folks to use the results of making the grade in their advocacy efforts. And what I think is important about these tools is that they show you in one place how a state does on all of our fairness indicators, and then also allow you to dig a little deeper into each indicator, looking at longer term trends in the data. Because the three factors all work together, and a state may be terrible in all areas or it may do well in all areas, but for many states, it's much more likely to be a mixed bag. So for example, we have a bunch of states in the Northeast and the Midwest where they get A's on level and often on effort as well, but then they have F's on distribution. So what this tells us is that the state is high spending relative to other states, but at the same time, it's highly inequitable. Low poverty districts outspend high poverty districts, creating significant resource disparities. So since we're about to have a conversation with experts from Georgia and North Carolina, I thought I would set the context for that conversation by quickly going over their results. So first, North Carolina gets an F on funding level, ranking 50th out of the 51 states plus DC. It also gets an F on effort, ranking dead last there. It performs slightly above average on funding distribution, getting a C. But because its overall funding level is so low, the slight progressivity in its funding system only provides about $600 more per pupil in high poverty districts. And I just want to highlight the effort trend data, showing how the state's effort has continued to decline over the last decade or so. And we can see from these charts that the state's GDP has been pretty steadily increasing up to 91%. The GDP was up 91% between 2008 and 2023. But if we look at state and local revenue for schools, that has only increased by 26% over the same period. If North Carolina had kept pace had kept its effort in line with national averages, it would be raising an additional $6,200 per pupil, sort of on average across the state. So this lack of effort is something that advocates have really been hammering on, and I think has been getting a pretty clear message out that is often repeated in media stories about school funding. So turning to Georgia, we find that it is also a low spending state, getting a D on funding level and ranked 35th out of the 51 in DC. Its effort is closer to average, getting a C, and its distribution is slightly above average, but still only getting a C, but ranking 15th out of the 48 ranked states. On average, high poverty districts in Georgia get about 8% or about $1,200 per pupil more than low poverty districts. So there are some funding mechanisms within the formula that are driving some additional funds to high poverty districts, but the funding boost is still much less than what we see in the more progressive states, where we see high poverty districts getting as much as 30% more funding. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn it back to Bob.
Thanks, Danielle. That was really informative. Appreciate that. And I note how you focused a lot this year on federal developments and sort of the federal contribution to state and local education budgets. And that's something that obviously we're at ELC are thinking about more and more this year and have been involved in some legal efforts to ensure that the developments in Washington, D.C. don't derail our national progress on school funding state by state. We already know that it may have a big impact and are going to be tracking that much more as the year progresses. Yeah, I want to turn it over to Kris and invite Kris to come back on screen to talk about North Carolina. Kris, you just first of all, you saw Danielle putting up some fairly dismal numbers there with
Dismal
North
plays,
Carolina.
Bob.
I mean, it's like it's never good to be last in things, but I guess it makes for clear messages with respect to what's going on. You saw North Carolina pretty much at the bottom or of two categories, level and effort, and about somewhere in the middle of the country in terms of distribution. Just first of all, just general comments about that observation. Does it track what you're noticing and any reactions to the overall performance and making the grade for North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, very much, very much tracks with what we see. Very much appreciate the making the grade reports. Um, just as one little example, the data on school funding effort comes out prior to the publication of the report, and I always, hit and refresh so I can update that data, especially on the school funding effort, since we're always ranked dead last. And I will put things out saying, hey, North Carolina, we're now dead last in school funding effort, and but it never really gets picked up in the press until ELC publishes it in their report. So it's very helpful to have a national partner that we can point to publishing, reliable data showing sort of the struggles we meet on that we have on adequacy and equity. Um, North Carolina, obviously, our funding's grossly inadequate, and it's been the subject of lawsuits that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute or two. But also on, the equity side of things, we get sort of middling marks. And, just to dig a little deeper, those marks are based solely on the income of students, and whether high poverty districts receive additional funding compared to low poverty districts. I've dug a little deeper into North Carolina, looking at other aspects of equity that I think a lot of us in the education community are interested in, such as racial equity, equity across language status, so dual language learners, as well as disability status, and looked at, not just whether or not districts are getting a little bit more money or a little bit less money compared to higher need or lower need districts, but also looking at how close those districts relate to adequate funding. So what does it take? What is estimated to take in those districts to meet state standards? And really, when you dig in deeper across the board, North Carolina's funding is uh, inequitable for all student groups, and it's been that way, sadly, for a long time.
Yeah, I know you've written about this, doing a deeper dive into the equity of the funding system in North Carolina. Do you have a resource or anything you could share with us on that?
Yeah, I can drop this in the chat. Did a report with some partners here in North Carolina called Creed, and that report can be found. Might just be in the panelist chat, but if you can add that to the general chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, no problem. And you mentioned the legal efforts. Given that North Carolina is so depressed in terms of funding levels and effort, there have been the Leandra lawsuits, very familiar to many of us in this school funding advocacy community. It's been going on in some format for decades now. Can you give us any update on the case as it now stands with the illustrious North Carolina Supreme Court, and then where you see this going next? Any tea leaves in the next couple of weeks, months?
Yeah, so Leandro case has been going on since 1994. And every step along the way, the courts have said North Carolina is not meeting its obligation to provide decent schools to all students. It's sort of you know, the small, the shortest summary I can provide of the case. In 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that the state has to fully fund what's called the Leandro Plan. This is an 8-year plan, which I encourage folks to take a look at because I think was a very good plan in terms of how progressive it was and how it really addressed the issues that ELC identifies in the Making the Grade report. But it was also very highly specific, exactly which funding streams need to increase by how much each year, which was somewhat, I think, pretty unique in school litigation cases, and provide an opportunity at least to provide some accountability. Unfortunately, after we got that ruling in the 2022, the partisan makeup of the court flipped basically the next day after the ruling, and the Republican Supreme Court decided, against legal precedent, to rehear the case that was just settled. That rehearing took place in February of 2024, and they have not issued a ruling since then. Um, I can go into greater depth about, my speculation as to why, but the net result is that none of the Leandro plan is getting funded. And that, I think our anticipation is that if we ever do get a ruling, that it won't be a good one. Um, and, we haven't, again, it hasn't been funded. We didn't even have a budget this past year. I
Mhm.
believe we're the only state in the nation that did not pass a budget. And, we have Republican control of the of the Senate and Republican control of the state House. And, it's not an issue of partisan politics. It's an issue of, um, I don't know, not no, not having an interest in running government properly, not having an interest in funding schools. So that's currently where we stand. I think if we do get a bad ruling, or if we continue in this weird situation where there is no ruling, from the advocacy side of things, we still point to the Leandro plan as the path forward. It shows, it's the product of a multi-year study led by some of the nation's leading, nonpartisan school finance experts, and it remains the only plan to achieve constitutional schools in North Carolina.
Yeah. Um, and so you mentioned that the legislature failed to pass the state budget this year. What is the impact of that for this year on schools? Are you any more optimistic that either that it will get passed soon or that next year will be better? And how and we also know that the legislature has been prioritizing tax cuts over increasing school funding year after year.
Mhm.
How are you pushing, how are advocates in North Carolina pushing back against those kinds of cuts and policies, and what messages have you found to be most successful?
Yeah. We've been pushing back through a lot of sort of, the normal advocacy channels that I think, folks across states and our communities have been using, having press conferences, publishing reports, having advocacy days, letters to the editor. And to be frank, none of it's working in North Carolina. We're continuing to pass additional tax cuts. Our school funding continues to be flat or decreasing once you account the additional costs facing schools. Um, so it's pretty bleak. And I would say, my lesson from this, like from an advocacy perspective, is that the issue is not so much like the story we're telling. The issue is really that in North Carolina, at least, our democracy is broken. So I think that we aren't going to get any good movement on schools until we fix our democracy.
Mm,
We are heavily gerrymandered. We have our state Senate and our state House. State Senate is veto-proof majority. State House is one seat away from a veto-proof majority. But North Carolina is not a rabidly conservative state. We're very much a purple state where, the partisan split is basically 50-50. Unfortunately, our government doesn't reflect that. And so I guess that would be my message to folks from other states is to be hyper aware of efforts to chip away at democracy in your states. Of course, we've seen efforts chipping away at democracy nationally as well. But at the state level, it's very hard to do the things that we need to do for students and for working class folks in general. Once your democracy, sort of democratic means for change are really taken away from you.
Got it. Yeah. Thanks, Kris. I guess one more question before I turn it over to DeAndrea. We know that North Carolina is facing increasing pressure from its universal school voucher program. And can you talk a little bit about how the expansion of vouchers in North Carolina has affected school funding and what strategies are advocates such as yourself using to push back against that? I understand as I ask these questions that we have you paint a very dire picture in North Carolina. So I hesitate to keep asking questions about what is really successful or what's working when it's
Yeah.
clear that many things aren't.
I've
But
got
talk
to
a
be
little.
honest. Not much is working. I wish I had a brighter, happier story for folks. So on school vouchers, in beginning with the 24-25 school year, North Carolina went from a voucher program that was limited based on family income, and there were some limits as far as having had to have previously been enrolled in a public school. Those limits were removed effective 24-25. So now, the primary beneficiaries of our voucher program are disproportionately wealthy families who are already enrolled in private schools. So, look, we actually got some good data finally about where students had previously been enrolled, and 85% of the new voucher money went to families who were already enrolled in private school,
Mhm.
very disproportionately weighted towards families. Our vouchers are means tested. You have different levels of voucher based on your family income. Um, Very disproportionately weighted towards those families in the unlimited bucket in the highest income group, compared to the general population of North Carolina. We're now spending $730 million a year on vouchers. It's the only program that has guaranteed funding increases. So, Bobby, you asked about what the impact was of not having a budget. In our public schools, they had to make do with the exact same funding they got in the prior school year. Um, you know, no matter what their enrollment changes were. Meanwhile, vouchers received more money, even though the program is already overfunded. It's actually based on the applications for this 25-26 school year. Looks like it's overfunded by about $190 million. They're still slated to get additional money for the 26-27 school year. Um, as far as what's worked, I think the most traction we've gotten has been pointing out the fraud angle. It's not just an angle; it's an actual fact. We've found, or I've found, situations where schools have had more vouchers than they reported enrollment, an indication that some of these schools might be resorting to ghost students, claiming more students than they actually have in order to take on additional voucher money. There's also been some good reporting from some actual journalists about what these schools look like. A lot of folks are still under the misconception that private schools, the schools receiving vouchers, um, are offering a superior education. They sort of miss the reality that most voucher schools, they might have 15, 20 kids in a church basement, um, you know, at, in front of a teacher who has no training, no formal training at least, and using curriculum that tell kids things like man walk with dinosaurs. So some of that reporting has also been effective. Unfortunately, hasn't really changed the facts on the ground. There's actually just a good podcast episode. If you look up the podcast Pretend, they recently did an episode about North Carolina's voucher system that I would recommend everyone.
Thanks, Kris. Yeah, really appreciate all your thinking so far and sharing with us what's going on in North Carolina and that last part about the voucher system having predictable increased funding in contrast to the regular K-12 system and its finance scheme there. So Appreciate you. I want to now invite DeAndrea to join us here. Again, DeAndrea comes to us from Georgia, where she's the Education Policy Fellow at IDRA. DeAndrea, are you there?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. How are you?
Good afternoon. Welcome to our session here, and really look forward to talking to you. You heard Danielle mention some of the stats around Georgia's school funding picture. Just to review, 35th in the nation around school funding levels, about 15th in the nation for school funding equity or distribution of funding between high and low poverty school districts. And right in the middle of the country in terms of school funding effort. So how did those what are any just broad observations or reactions to that sort of set of grades for Georgia and how that tracks with your experience?
So currently there is a representative, Phil Olalio. He's working on a poverty rate bill because Georgia is one of 5 or 6 states that doesn't have poverty funding for students living in poverty. It hits directly like in our city, but also it hits those rural communities in Georgia. Because
Mhm.
everybody thinks Atlanta is like Georgia, but there's Atlanta and then there's Georgia, those rural areas where schools are even still having connectivity issues.
Mhm.
Another big issue is that we haven't updated our school funding formula since 1985, and that's 41 years. So a lot of things have changed in 41 years that students are needing, and it also affects those kids with disabilities that much more, especially with the Medicaid cuts federally. So we're definitely needing some state protections when it comes down to school funding.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, the idea that you wouldn't have an updated formula or look at the calculations for that amount of time, up through the current moment. I understand that Georgia has long stood out as one of the few states that hasn't provided dedicated funding in its formula for students living in poverty. And you and many advocates across the state have been advocating for a so-called opportunity weight, which would provide additional funding under the formula for students in poverty. Can you tell us about that campaign and how did you get legislators to kind of get invested in that issue?
Basically good old grassroots. With parent groups, a lot of times parents thought that they wanted the charters, but they saw that the heavy funding of charters was taken away from public schools, which means it takes away from jobs, walkability, transportation. So once parents start noticing that, and like it's not that they don't want the school in their neighborhood, they just want the schools in their neighborhoods to be better. So the charters were shiny golden chains because they would open for a little while sometimes and then close, or they would get their children in school and have transportation issues, or they would see that, hey, even though my child is making A's, this is a failing school. So, I thought of taking my child out of the public and putting them in charter. So those are some of the things that parents start having conversations about at town hall meetings, and we got down to the bottom of it. Parents want the school in their neighborhood to be a good school. So that's why sometimes the choice is that charter or private or school outside of the neighborhood. But when you think about community, um, if my child doesn't have a bus, I don't get to meet the bus driver. The grandparents can't walk them to school. Those type of things when it comes down to community with parents. So just having town hall meetings feels nice enough to come to the schools and invite parents into the Capitol. There were other bills before, but this is the best opportunity way bill that we've seen thus far. And hopefully it actually gets movement this session. And we're hopeful of that.
Yeah. So what am I correct that the legislature did start a pilot program to put more funding in for students at low income students in its funding formula and that was not continued for next year, but there was a brief pilot program where there was kind of a weight put in to support students in poverty. Did you
No, where there were talks of it, but then it didn't go
I
anywhere last
see.
year. So there were talks of it. They even talked about using the state revenue. But because they said that's not a solid formula, because they don't want to pay teachers on just the emergency funds, because how would they pay them later? They don't want to do that. So that's why we're working to get more. The Opportunity Way bill will make them put more in the budget when it's budget week to fund the schools, basically.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, well, fingers crossed that that kind of policy change will make some headway in the upcoming legislative session. Um, what I noticed that Georgia has about 13% of its funds for school funding come from the federal government. North Carolina, I looked up before this webinar, was 18%. Are there any concerns about what's going on federally with school funding? I know that we got renewed school funding for FY27 from DC, but that funding is not guaranteed in future years. Any concerns or advocacy around reacting from the Trump administration's policies to dismantle the federal government apparatus around education? Is any of that making noise or headway in Georgia or a concern for advocates?
Yes, the dismantle of the Office of Civil Rights definitely has parents in the uproar, because that was our saving grace when it came down to when schools weren't doing right, when the Title I schools weren't providing the services but were receiving federal funds. Like, that was most parents' backup plan when on the state and level and a district level, especially the special education piece, we really rely on the federal government to make schools in our state provide services, IEP, 504 plans, and just the Title I services for parents. So that we definitely do rely on the federal government for that. And the free lunch program money. Like, our governor sent back money to feed. Last year, our governor sent the federal money back to feed kids over the summer. So that was a huge concern, because, again, where were those kids? Who doesn't want to feed a 5-year-old
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
summer?
Thank you so much for providing your perspective on what's going on in Georgia. And I think I want to invite all the panelists to come back on just to answer some questions that we have across the board from our from that we've seen in the Q&A and so forth. Maybe I'll just start off by asking a question to all of you around the fact that many districts are experiencing funding challenges. And I guess the question is it due to sort of the funding formula itself that has created these challenges, or a lack of strategic planning on the local level, or perhaps both? Any thoughts about how funding formulas uh, account for, and how much of a part of the challenges districts are experiencing, how much can be attributable to the formula itself? Danielle, you want to start us off there?
Sure. I mean, I think that the answer to the question is probably both and.
Yeah.
So, districts are having financial challenges for a bunch of reasons. Largely, I think a huge factor being facing the loss of the federal funding that they had been relying on through those COVID relief funds, and now they're starting to see these sort of holes in their budget. They can't, if they were using those federal funds to support staffing and other, like human resources. And now they just don't have the money to continue paying for them. So that is one enormous problem, but I think it sort of illustrates the fact that it is a systemic problem. So if, school districts were using funding from federal revenue or, any other resource to create these jobs and programs to support students, that they, are working well enough that they're interested in keeping them moving forward. I mean, obviously, we know that students are still behind in terms of academic recovery from COVID and all other, sort of even pre-pandemic losses in achievement. So, if those programs were working and they want to continue them, they need to find a revenue source. What is not happening in most places is that school funding formulas are not updated and adapted nearly as frequently enough to adjust to those needs that change, on sort of a longer term basis, but also, the more sort of immediate pressing concerns that we have because of COVID.
Yeah. Kris, any response to this? I mean, it's kind of hard to think about strategic planning as a source for district woes, given the stats we just heard from North Carolina,
Yeah,
50th in the nation in levels and in effort. I think a lot of is it safe to say a lot of the funding challenges at the district level are attributable directly to those kinds of statistics?
definitely. I think it's not a question of the formulas so much as it's a question of political will.
Yeah,
Obviously, in North Carolina, you've seen our school funding effort plummet. But really, across all states, if you look at the report, in almost every state, school funding effort has decreased since before the Great Recession. So the money exists in our economy to provide, much more robust funding for schools than we currently are. It's just a question of the political will. A lot of that money resides in the bank accounts of very wealthy people. As we continue to see wealth inequality grow across the country, um, I think a lot of the political will to actually tax the people that have the wealth in order to adequately fund our schools is unfortunately lacking. But I think that is sort of the bigger culprit than, things like school funding formulas.
yeah. Um, DeAndrea, did you have something else to add to that
Yes,
question?
I'm going to piggyback and say in Georgia, it definitely is both. It's definitely a funding formula issue. We do need to revisit that formula. The funding formula is almost as old as I am, and I mean, we just have a different set of needs now. Also, we need legislators to have the courage. We have a lot of big business in Georgia and wealthy people, even when it comes down to the film industry. So we need some tax allocations, and we need legislators to know the importance of education and how that will influence the job market. Or if you people, everybody wants to move to Georgia, but can we be proud of educating children here? That's kind of something that you have to think about. And yeah, it's definitely a funding issue, definitely when it boils down to it. And I think we need to bring back just community pressure. More people need to come to the people's house and share their stories so they can see how it affects, people in real time. Because sometimes legislators are so far removed from even having a child in school, what they think will work and what actually work are two totally different ideologies.
Thank you. And DeAndrea, if I could stay with you for a minute, I wanted to ask, to the extent that you work with at the local level and with helping staff advocate to school boards as they're making all these decisions around cutting school programs, for example, ELL programs for our bilingual students. Also, we know that parents are really important in getting involved in school funding advocacy. Any recommendations or thoughts about how advocates can be effective embracing engaging parents and also just engaging with school boards who make a lot of difficult decisions at the local level around funding?
So I think we need to learn how to communicate with people on all levels. A lot of times, different people, families have different makeups. And I worked for an organization not too long ago, Atlanta Thrive, and we got the goals and guardrails passed in APS, and that was just around failing schools. So one of the things that we did was just communicating with people on their levels. Like those parents at Amazon, you can leave a one pager. A lot of people don't know why it's important to have school funding. They don't know how it affects them in their regular life. I worked a 12-hour shift and my husband worked a 14-hour shift. So having a long, articulate plan about bills that doesn't let or educate a regular everyday parent on how this is affecting my school, why the school bus got cut, why my child doesn't eat lunch because the food is nasty, why my child doesn't get the para that they used to have last year. I think education is super important around there. Learning how to communicate with people just on a fifth grade level. Keep it sweet and short because once they get passionate about it, they'll know where to go. Having places for them to go when an issue hits them is super important too. I don't think we have enough. You know how you call 211? We need something like that for education or just an app that parents can go to. It's not that they don't care, they don't know why they care or why they need to care in the moment.
Thank you. Kris and Danielle, anything to add around local advocacy, school board engagement, parent engagement, anything that would help?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to a school finance expert named David I. Backer. He's done a lot of workshops on teaching folks how to read local school budgets in order to improve their advocacy. So I would recommend people take a look at his work. It's David Backer.
Great, thank you.
That's great. I would also add, just maybe not specifically from the parent perspective, but there's a question also in the Q&A about how staff can advocate to the school boards about maybe the programs that they themselves are, employed to teach. So, this is not directly related, but at ELC, we have this ongoing project about using research evidence to protect our schools against the dismantling of the federal education department. And we have tackled a couple of discrete issues, one of them being English learners and English language acquisition grants through Title III, and trying to bring research evidence into the conversation so that those staff members can take those sort of statistics and knowledge around what we do know about what works to make sure that those school boards are also educated, because we know that people that are serving on school boards don't have 40 hours a week to devote to education policy, but to try and bring, hopefully some of those resources that we posted online that I will share in the chat, to, some clear talking points about what works, and why those programs need to be protected. And so we have some for English learners, and we'll soon have the same for IDEA and special education.
That's great. And Danielle, while we have you, could I follow up and ask you about making the grade itself, this report, and how it's broken down at the state level? Can parents use that? Can staff use that in local advocacy? And just walk us through how that works, how that could work out for people?
Yeah, I mean, that is our ultimate hope, right? Is that this report is simple and comprehensible enough that the average parent can sort of look through the report card and understand where things are going well and where things are going poorly, and hopefully use that information to advocate for their kids and their students. So we do have those online tools that you can go through and look at your individual state. I'm always honestly happy for people to reach out if they have questions about some of the messaging around where their state falls on the report card. So yeah, we hope that that is the ultimate resource for people.
Thank you. DeAndrea, did you have something else that you wanted to add there?
I just wanted to highlight what Danielle said about research. We have a lot of data and we have a lot of research that we're not using. And we also have a lot of successes that we're not duplicating. If we have one state that's at number one, we need to learn how to start borrowing the good things instead of recreating things that don't work and waste time. And we have two generations of children that missed out on we already had a solution to.
Thank you. And DeAndrea, there was a question also in the chat about parents' sentiment about vouchers in Georgia specifically. Do you have a sense of how parents in different communities around the state are reacting to vouchers and their impacts on school funding?
So I will say Georgia is half and half. There are a lot of parents that are pro vouchers. But I used to think that vouchers were a good thing myself. But when you see how vouchers take from the public school system, they also, I don't know if you guys know, there was a neighborhood here in Atlanta, Forest Cove, and there was a school called Thomasville Heights that was with purpose built. So everybody thought they wanted a charter, but the charter closed and the school was dismantled, the neighborhood. People lost jobs, people moved, so it participated in gentrification. But there are a lot of parents pro charter. And as a parent, I can't tell parents to put their kids in an unsafe place while they wait on the school to change. That's why I said, like, and just being in community, I learned it's not that parents don't want to send their kids to the school, but maybe it's not safe and maybe it's not teaching their kids what they need to learn. So I can't tell them to fight the fight and not take care of their children at the same time. So I would say Georgia is pretty split down the middle. There were a lot of people at, pro voucher day, but I personally, I'm not a charter person, but it's hard to tell parents to fight the fight while they want to put their kids in they want to put their kids in the best possible place. So I have to educate them on the level that they're ready for.
Thank you. I just want to go around and give everyone one last chance to sort of make a point about the school funding picture. What might be helpful for our listeners here to, as they engage in their state, what would be something that you would recommend focusing on, or maybe be something to highlight in the report itself, or another strategy that we might not have mentioned so far. Danielle, you want to start us off there?
Sure. Well, so much, but I think that, the important thing is that these conversations don't happen unless the legislatures in our states are forced to have them. So, I think there tends to be a recognition on the part of many state legislators that schools are struggling right now, that finances are tough, and that it's difficult to get students all the resources they need. But at the same time, there does seem to be this disconnect on how we are going to get more resources to schools, and the way that we do that is by increasing revenue and making sure that it goes to the places that need it most. So I think, using, we've been saying, like, using the data to try and make those points and try to get your champions within your state to continue to keep having this conversation. And it's a long, long struggle, as everyone on this panel can attest to. Even here in New Jersey, we've been fighting for a fully funded formula for almost 20 years. So it's not easy anywhere, but it does take everybody's hard work to get the conversation going and sustained.
Thank you. Kris, any parting advice for us?
Well, I don't have a lot of successes here in North Carolina, but I think, one thing I've learned is that data alone isn't going to do the trick. And that when I've seen successful cases of legislators being convinced of things that their ideology generally they're not predisposed to, it's really through storytelling. So if you're able to connect these, this data to stories and get those stories of, what our educators, what our students are actually facing in underfunded public schools, getting those stories in front of legislators is the key.
Thank you. DeAndrea, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I think we need to connect more parents and educators because we're actually on the same side fighting the systematic issues at hand. So more parent-teacher connections. We need the same things. We just gotta work together. Definitely more shared stories and just bringing back shame. In a way, we have to bring back shame and probably lawsuits too when it comes down to it.
Thank you for those perspectives. And I'll just close out by just adding that I think that we've seen through this conversation that school funding is such an important part of what governments are responsible for providing for our citizens. And it's clear that there is funds and there is a will to provide funding for important things. Just even in the last couple of days, I was reflecting on as our country enters another war overseas, and some of the data they are talking about data. You can see how spending on wars since 9/11, according to one major university, is about $8 trillion. And the calculation for a war like something like Iran, we don't know where it's going to go. It just started. But sort of my paper napkin analysis of that is that could equal the federal education spending in K-12 education for the next 20 years. Is the equivalent of a major investment in a major expenditure for wartime efforts and so forth. So it's just food for thought that our governments at the state levels and at the federal level, that we make choices and we have priorities, and these are really important discussions for us to continue to engage with our elected representatives about what's important in this country and what we should be fighting for. So with that, I thank everyone, all of our panelists, for joining us, for giving your important perspectives. Please continue to follow all of our organizations online. We will continue to have Making the Grade information, posting it on our website, as well as associated and related data and research. So with that, I want to wish everyone a good afternoon and have a good rest of the week. Bye, everyone.